Well, brethren, as you probably are all aware, if you live in one of the main westernized countries, you've probably been bombarded this past month, with all the various different, forms of celebrating what our Western nations have come to call Pride Month, which, to put it in biblical terms, is basically just a month set aside to celebrate the values and morals of Sodom and Gomorrah, of just sexual debauchery and gender confusion, is typically what it's all focused on, and really just trying to get to kind of just jam it down the throat of the culture and normalize it and get everyone to accept it. I mean, you see it in advertising. It's infiltrated the policies of HR departments of most companies, through their diversity initiatives and such, basically just trying to normalize and force participation of this kind of lifestyles upon people. And even in this fast couple of months, I mean, there's been a few companies, for example, like Bud Light and Target, for example, who've pushed it so hard that they've really wound up getting a major backlash, from a number of their customers because of their stances on this. In fact, in the month of June, there was an event that took place at the U.S. White House, kind of in favor of this whole Pride Month celebration. And by way of introduction, I'd like to read to you an article that comments about this. This is actually from a news service called the Daily Wire. They're kind of an online service that they do news articles. They also have a number of commentators that do video programs and such. And they more or less tend to come from a more Judeo-Christian values, perspective. I subscribe to their service. I certainly don't agree with everything they come up with, but again, they tend to be more generally founded, in Judeo-Christian values than a lot of things in our society today. And periodically, a number of their commentators will kind of send out emails to their subscribers, making an article addressing various subjects. And I'd like to, by way of introduction, read to you an email that was sent out by the Daily Wire on June 13th of this year. It was written by one of their main commentators named Ben Shapiro. He entitled it, "Biden's Ideological Coup, Destroying Our Value System." It says, quote, "We are seeing a complete ideological coup in the United States. The Judeo-Christian value system is being entirely destroyed in favor of pride progress, radical leftist gender, and idealistic nonsense." Joe Biden put up this tweet, quote, "Today the People's House, your house, sends a clear message to the country and to the world. America is a nation of pride," end quote. The tweet showed an LGBTQ flag hanging from the center of the rotunda of the White House, looking out over the White House lawn. "Your new regime is the Pride Progress regime. You'll be ruled by it. It's no longer a matter of whatever floats your boat or live your own life behind private doors. That is no longer what the United States is. The United States is now a place where the official doctrine is that boys can be girls and girls can be boys. If you stand up to that, you could wind up in actual legal peril. This is a country where if you say that marriage is between one man and one woman, you could be criminalized. You could have your life taken away from you in a wide variety of ways because this is the new regime. There is no neutral position. The American flag was put aside and the Pride Progress flag was flown in its place. This is a coup. It is a coup because, ideologically speaking, no American soldier has ever died for the Pride Progress flag, because no American soldier has ever served under the Pride Progress flag, because this is not the elected flag of the United States. No law has ever been passed under the Pride Progress flag. It is not the flag of the United States. All you have to do to understand how sick and perverse this is to just replace the Pride Progress flag with the flag of the Vatican. If you put it up there, everybody would recognize that as a coup. But the Pride Progress flag there? Everyone says, well, that's just neutrality. It's secular neutrality. It is not secular, and it is not neutral. It is a religious movement, a fanatic religious movement dedicated to destroying all of its opposition through silencing, and yes, the force of law. When you see that flag hanging, it is no shock. You've seen Barack Obama all the way back in 2015 lighting up the White House in gay pride colors. When you see giant Pride Progress flags centered above the seal of the President of the United States, while the two American flags are shunted off to either side, that could possibly be a violation of the flag code. When you see this, you recognize what is happening here: a complete destruction of one ethos and its replacement by another. See, what he's referring to is what's happening here is basically the complete undermining of Judeo-Christian values. And again, if you look today at what we typically refer to as Western civilization, and even historically back through human history, again, what we often refer to as as a Western civilization, is typically your nations that have been more or less kind of founded upon a foundation of general Judeo-Christian values. And by saying that, I'm not at all suggesting that these nations were truly faithful and always worshiping the true God. Obviously that's not the case. But again, if you look at their foundation in history, kind of in comparison to world history in general, one of the reasons why Western civilization has been, more successful and it had a greater prosperity and freedom and such compared to the rest of the world is that foundation in Judeo-Christian values. But what we're seeing is all of that being completely undermined. We're seeing basically its destruction. And as we're going to see today in the sermon, the Bible literally directly tells us that when you see this kind of environment, when you see this debauchery and just homosexuality extant and all this gender confusion, this is a direct sign, and we're going to see this directly stated in the Bible, that God has basically stepped back and handed over a culture to Satan to let him take the reins for its destruction. We're going to see that directly stated in the Bible. Because what we're witnessing here is actually the demise of Western civilization. And if you're looking for a title for this sermon, it's The Demise of Western Civilization. Because again, that is what we're watching here. So to start off with, as I mentioned, the Bible directly tells us that the environment that we're witnessing here today in all of our Western nations is directly stated in the Bible as a sign that God has basically stepped back and handed over a culture because of their disobedience to Satan to allow him to take the reins and just run wild with it. Now turn over to Romans chapter 1, and we'll see this directly stated in the Bible. Romans chapter 1, we're going to start reading here in verse 18. Now, as we read through this, I want you to notice there are 3 different times in the verses we're going to read here where it basically uses the language of, God gave them up, or he gave them over. Because it's basically saying he gives them over to a debased mind to just, follow debauchery. But just think about the spiritual forces, the war that is going on behind the scenes in our world. We fight not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers. The book of Job gives us a real good idea of how this works. Again, we won't turn there. I've covered this many times in the past. But it explains there how God has basically taken Satan as a servant, and he's like a dog on a leash. And God always controls, how much leeway he gives in the leash. And it explains in here when people just, a culture has just completely rejected God and insists on going their own way, well, he gives Satan more slack in the leash and allows him to just run with it. Because he basically tells the culture, okay, if you're just going to insist on going your own way, okay, I'm going to let you reap the rewards of that. You're not going to enjoy it, but I'll let you have your way. It's going to go badly. But let's notice here in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. Now again, if you look up the Greek there for Godhead there, it's really referring to his divinity, to his nature. It's not referring to a Trinitarian concept there. But continuing on, so that they are without excuse, because although they knew God, they did not glorify God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became foolish and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Therefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness. And that's the first reference. I mentioned this is stated 3 times in these verses. He gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up, that's number 2, to vile passions. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Now, what you can see what's being described here is lesbianism and homosexuality. And continue on in verse 27. Likewise also men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And even as they did not retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over, that's reference number 3, to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Now, as I mentioned kind of in the introduction, we have a culture that's trying to force these kind of values on us. So even if you don't take part in it, they want you to approve of those who practice it. Oftentimes it's referred to, you should be an ally. In other words, if you're not a part of this debauchery lifestyle, well, you should promote it. You should be in favor of it and cheer for it. That's what they call being an ally, and that's literally what the culture is trying to turn us into. So as we're going to see here, there are numerous examples in the Bible where it attaches this kind of, again, gender confusion and debauchery, with the destruction of a society. You're basically seeing a society on the brink of self-destruction. And again, the reason being, as this chapter is laid out here, it's once your rebellion gets to this level, it's that God gives them up. He just steps back and says, okay, if you want to do your own thing, have at it. And what happens then is, again, just the loss of just the basic foundation of, again, male and female. So something so blatantly obvious is just the basic that there's only 2 genders. People become confused over issues like that. And that's what's happening. But we'll see numerous times in the Bible, again, this is correlated with the destruction of a society. So turn over to Leviticus chapter 18. We'll see another example of this. Leviticus chapter 18. Now, we're going to read through this chapter here. If you have a New King James translation of the Bible like I do that has the subheadings in it, you'll see over chapter 18 it talks about the laws of sexual morality. But I want you to notice as we read through this, in the latter part of this chapter, God specifically states, that committing all the sins that he is laying out here is one of the reasons why he's kicking the Canaanites out of the promised land. He's saying, but basically, this is why I'm wiping them out, is because they performed all these sins. They practiced this. And he warns the Israelites, if you take on these sins, you're going to get thrust out of the land as well. Your society is going to collapse as well. But I want you to pay attention as we read through this. It is talking about the laws of sexual morality, but most of what's covered here is not, just the simple rule of, that the sexuality should be confined to a marriage, which is what the Bible teaches. This is way farther into debauchery than just the issue of, well, they had committed relationships and couples and they were just fooling around before they got married. I mean, that's sin, but that's this goes way beyond those types of things, because the majority of this chapter goes into kind of defining incest, on pretty much every combination. It gets very specific in nailing down every form of incest you could possibly think of. It also addresses homosexuality and bestiality. So what we're talking about is, again, very depraved, debaucherous behavior that just throws away basic morality, is what we're getting at here. But notice here in Leviticus 18, starting in verse 1. Then Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am Jehovah your God. According to the doings of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, you shall not do according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you, you shall not do, nor shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall observe my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am Jehovah your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am Jehovah. None of you shall approach anyone who is near of kin in him to uncover his nakedness. I am Jehovah your God. And notice that emphasis on your kin. Because most of what's covered here is going to be different versions of that. He's basically forbidding all forms of incest, is what he's getting at here. In verse 7, the nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother, you shall not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover. She is your father's nakedness. The nakedness of your sister, the daughter of your father, or the daughter of your mother, whether born at home or elsewhere, their nakedness you shall not uncover. The nakedness of your son's daughter, or your daughter's daughter, their nakedness you shall not uncover, for theirs is your own nakedness. And the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, begotten by your father, she is your sister. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is near of kin to your father. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is near of kin to your mother. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. You shall not approach his wife. She is your aunt. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter, nor shall you take your son's daughter or her daughter's daughter, or uncover her nakedness. They are near kin to her. It is wickedness. Nor shall you take a woman as a rival to her sister to uncover her nakedness while the other is alive. Also, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness as long as she is in her customary impurity. Moreover, you shall not lie carnally with your neighbor's wife, nor defile yourself with her. And you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am Jehovah. I notice here it's referring to passing your children through the fire in Molech. This was basically child sacrifice. Today we think of it more clinically. We call it abortion. But it's basically the same thing. When you have a society of rampant sexual immorality, the natural result is you wind up with a lot of unwanted pregnancies and unwanted children. We deal with that today through what we call abortion. But back then they didn't have quite the science to do it that way. They just did it through child sacrifice, throwing the children in the fire. But it's still the same murder of children, that it is. It's just done in a different manner. And so basically you can see we've got the same culture going on today of what he's describing here. And in verse 22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman is an abomination, nor shall you mate with any beast to defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman stand before a beast to mate with it. It is perversion. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, nor by all the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. Notice the reason he's wiping out the Canaanites, and he's just done with their society, is because of all this perversion. That's what I'm saying. This correlates with the end, the destruction of a civilization. In verse 25, for the land is defiled, therefore I visit the punishment of its iniquity upon it, and the land vomits out its inhabitants. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, shall not commit any of these abominations, either any of your own nation or any stranger who sojourns among you. For all these abominations the men of the land have done, who were before you, and thus the land is defiled. Lest the land vomit you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. For whoever commits any of these abominations, the persons who commit them, shall be cut off from among their people. Therefore you shall keep my ordinances, so that you do not commit any of these abominable customs which are committed before you, that you do not defile yourselves by them. I am Jehovah your God. So notice he basically, again, we see the same sign of when you see this rampant gender confusion, sexual debauchery, all of these practices going. This is an indication of a civilization is on the brink of destruction, and God's about to bring about its end. And we'll see this several times throughout the Bible. In fact, to see another example of this, turn over to Genesis chapter 19. We'll see here the famous story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's Genesis chapter 19. Now, to fully appreciate this story, you need to understand the end of chapter 18. I'm not going to take the time to read it, but I will kind of summarize it because it puts a little more context on what happens in chapter 19. In chapter 18, God has a conversation with Abraham. Basically gives him a heads up, that he's aware of what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's about to go destroy it as a result. Abraham's thinking, my nephew Lot lives over there. I don't want him to get caught up in all this, so he starts negotiating with God. And of course, this plays out, with the numbers over time, and just to make a long story short, it ends with basically an agreement between, Lot and God that if God finds 10 righteous people there, he promises that he won't wipe out the city if there's at least 10 people, that are righteous and trying to live a good life. Well, we know as a result of the fact that he still burns up the city and takes Lot and his family out, there's not even 10 people in this area who are living a righteous life at all. So again, that puts a context on what we're about to read here. So now let's start off here in chapter 19, verse 1. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. And when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, that you may arise early and go on your way. And they said, No, but we will spend the night in the open square. But he insisted strongly. So they turned into him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. Now notice how that's worded. It says basically everybody from around the area. Now you could argue whether, is that every single person from around the area or not? You might debate that issue. But again, let's keep in mind, there weren't even 10 righteous people in the city. So obviously what's happening here is representative of the entire area in the culture of what's taking place. Whether it's every single person or not, this is representative of the culture and the conduct of the area of what's taking place. In verse 5, and they called to Lot and said to him, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them carnally. So Lot went out to them through the doorway and shut the door behind him. And he said, Please, my brethren, do not be so wickedly. And now I have 2 daughters that they have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, that you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since these are the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof. And they said, stand back. And then they said, this one came in to sojourn, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. But the men reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were in the doorway of the house with blindness, and both small and great, so that they became weary and trying to find the door. Now notice here once again, as we know how the story ends, God brings down fire here in brimstone and wipes out the city. But again, if you notice the behavior here, but also notice what happens. First of all, Lot, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the sermon. While he's certainly better than the people around the area, look at what his solution to the problem is. What they're basically wanting to commit homosexual rape on the men who were there. His solution is, don't do that, take my daughters and just do heterosexual gang rape on them. I certainly wouldn't want to be Lot's daughter, and to be treated like that. We can see how the culture has, very much affected his character. I mean, he's better than the culture around him, but he's honestly just a milder version, in terms of how it's perverted his character. But notice also, all he did to them was again suggest that, don't do homosexual rape, do heterosexual rape. And their response is, this guy judges us. How dare he say this? I mean, think about that. You can see a lot of similarities in our culture today. If you suggest something is wrong with this kind of culture, well, you're full of hate. Well, you're a hateful person. You're phobic. You're bad. And you're like, no, I'm just suggesting that people shouldn't act this bad. But you're put down because you're supposed to be an ally. You're supposed to praise it. You're supposed to be a part of it and approve of it and cheer for it. And if you don't, you're a bad person. Don't we have the same kind of culture today? Okay, see, that's exactly what's happening here. That's why we're watching the demise of Western civilization. Because we're on the verge of self-destruction. I would not be surprised in the next few decades here if we see the collapse of a lot of Western nations, from within. They don't need an external force to attack us. We'll destroy ourselves from within. But what we're going to see here is, oftentimes we talk about the fact that, the structure of society is based upon the family. That the breakdown of the family, is basically, what causes all manner of social problems in a society to cave in. Because what I want you to see throughout this sermon is what we're seeing here, again, with the demise of a society with, rampant debauchery and homosexuality and gender confusion. That's kind of the end of the movie, you might say. Well, what we're going to see here is where this starts in the progression of basically how it starts minor and slowly works its way there. And what we're going to see is it starts with the undermining of biblical gender roles and then the undermining of the family structure. And then slowly works its way over time to absolute collapse. So let's notice, first of all, turn over to Exodus chapter 20. I want you to see how just the family structure itself is aligned with, again, the successful survival of a culture and of a nation. Because I gave a sermon on the fifth commandment here, maybe about a year ago. And I commented that the promise of the fifth commandment, is not about, individual long life. It's not the issue of, well, if I honor my parents, well, then that guarantees I'm going to live a long life. No, it's about the survival of a nation and its national security because of how important the family structure is to it. So let's read here in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12. It says, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which Jehovah your God is giving you. See, he's attaching this specifically to, this is very important that you extend your time, living in the promised land. Because the whole issue, the whole a covenant, Israel's part of the agreement. God's part of the agreement was, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to give you this land, I'm going to be your God and look after you. Well, their part of the agreement was they're going to obey him, and they're going to follow his commandments. Now, what's interesting is obviously all 10 of these commandments are important. They're all his instructions. They're all things that they're required to do. But this one he specifically ties to, you want to live long in the land. This one's pivotal to that because the family structure is very important to a successful society. Once your nuclear family falls apart, your society is in trouble. And if you just think about it, if you're going to raise children, to where they're going to grow up with a healthy respect for their parents and honor their parents and be well behaved, what's fundamental to that? Well, mom and dad have got to have a good relationship and get along with each other and be setting the right example, because if a child's raised up in chaos and mom and dad are all fighting with each other and dysfunction, well, that's going to mess up how the child's raised, and that's going to have a multi-generational effect. So where this all comes back to is, again, mom and dad have to be setting the right example in how they raise the children. This is kind of where it starts. Well, this brings us back to the subject of marriage. And what we're going to see is, from the Bible's perspective, the critical issue with marriage comes down to biblical gender roles. Now, I gave a multiple sermon series on this several years ago. I want to say maybe back in 2016. They're all on the website. I'm only going to briefly touch on the subject today. But one of the things I mentioned in that series is, if you go into a bookstore today, almost anywhere in the U.S., you're typically going to find, there's going to be some section in the bookstore that's, relationship, marriage, self-help oriented and such, and you'll find, all sorts of, books and material there. And again, as I mentioned in that sermon series, kind of, a wide spectrum from things that could be edifying and helpful information to just pure garbage, and things all in between. And there'll be a lot of different angles that they'll look at, information again that, and in many cases, might be helpful, in helping a marriage relationship. But the interesting thing is, if you look at what the Bible focuses on, whenever the Bible focuses on marriage, there's a very clear focus, very consistent throughout the Bible when it talks about it. It's biblical gender roles. And it flies in the face of everything that our culture is talking about today. Because it starts with the concept of there's two genders. There's men and there's women. There's no such thing as in between. And those roles are uniquely different. There's a role for a husband. There's a role for a wife. They're uniquely defined as different. They're not interchangeable. And if they're correctly done, they work well together and create a synergism that creates a productive, healthy family. So let's just briefly look at this. Turn over to Exodus chapter 5. No, actually, Ephesians chapter 5, sorry. Ephesians chapter 5. Again, Ephesians chapter 5, and we'll start in verse 22. It says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the husbands be to the wives to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church, and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of the water of the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies, but he who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of the body, and of his flesh, and of his bones. And for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. There is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. And what you'll notice again is if you read through, particularly the New Testament, through Paul's writings and even Peter's writings on the subject, again, you always see it defined. It's not just spouses do X, it's always husbands, here's your role, wives, here's your role, and if you're both performing this, it'll work well together, but it doesn't teach it as unisex, as something that's interchangeable and all the same. Now, you're probably aware that our society today just thinks that is just anathema. I mean, that is just sexist and archaic to even suggest such a thing, that there could be separate roles. But again, this is where it starts. You start with just basically rejecting those roles, and then it gets to where we are today of there's no such thing as gender. Gender is a spectrum, and you just identify with whatever you want. And men can be women, and women can be men. And we just get into insanity, and then everything is just blurred, and we wind up with chaos and complete societal breakdown. And this is at the core of where the problem is. Now, turn over to Genesis chapter 2 here, because what I want you to see is, again, as I mentioned, it always, it starts off with undermining biblical gender roles. That's the beginning of the problem. It ends up with, again, societal destruction. But again, it's a slow process that undermines over time. Now we're going to start off with kind of, where everything went wrong in the Garden of Eden, and you'll see that this is fundamental to the process. Now, before we read the section in Genesis 3, I'm going to start actually getting a little context in chapter 2. We'll start in Genesis 2 in verse 15. It says, "Then Jehovah God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and to keep it. And Jehovah God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in that day you eat of it, you shall surely die. And Jehovah God said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper compared to him." And then skip down to verse 21. "And Jehovah God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept, and he took one of the ribs and closed up the flesh of its place. And then the rib which Jehovah God had taken from the man he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. And Adam said, This is how now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, in the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." Now, there's a reason why I started here in chapter 2. And again, I'm going to add a little bit of speculation and opinion here, but what I want you to see here is when we read through chapter 3, how Satan played upon the weaknesses of both the man and the woman. He was very strategic here. He knew what both of their hot buttons were and their weak spots, and he played upon that to get them to both sin. But I also want you to see the total breakdown in how gender roles should have played out here, because that was fundamental to where everything went awry here. Now, the reason I kind of read this is, you notice if we read through this, God creates Adam first. There's some gap in time between when God creates Adam and when he creates Eve. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly how long that gap of time is. It records for us that God gives Adam the instructions of, you can touch everything else in the garden, but the tree of knowledge, good and evil, that's off limits, don't touch that. There is no recording of God directly having this conversation with Eve present, because when he has this conversation, Eve hasn't been created yet. Now, what this is speculation, but we're going to see it's very consistent with what the New Testament says about biblical gender roles. As we're going to see here in a minute, the New Testament very much says the husband is supposed to be the spiritual leader of the family, and teaching spiritual principles is a responsibility given to men, and men are again supposed to be the leader of the family. Not that women shouldn't study and have all their part in as well. It's just, again, that leadership role is given to the men. So it would be very consistent with that to speculate that when God created Eve, he entrusted Adam with the role of passing this information on to her, because again, that's very consistent with what we're about to read in the New Testament. But either way, regardless of how it happens, we know from when chapter 3 starts, Eve is obviously already familiar with these instructions. We can tell that with her conversation with Satan in the garden. But now let's notice what plays out in chapter 3, because we're also going to see the inherent weaknesses of both the men and women that Satan played upon, because he was very strategic. He knew exactly how to play this game. This is Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which Jehovah God had made. And he said to the woman, Has God indeed said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, God said, You shall not eat, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. So obviously Eve is aware of the instructions. Again, either God may have told her that directly, or he may have entrusted Adam to do it. Either way, we know Eve's aware of it. In verse 4, And the serpent said to the woman, You shall not surely die, for God knows that it is in the day that you eat, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her husband, and he ate. Now, if we analyze what took place here, what we're going to see is Satan was very skillful in how he went about this, because he understood the psychological makeup of both of the parties involved, and he knew how to play the chess game to his advantage. Now, also keep in mind, and we're going to read this in the New Testament here in just a minute, the New Testament definitively tells us Eve was deceived by this, Adam wasn't. So that we can kind of get some insight there as to what's going on with this. Now, if we look at the logic of the argument that Satan makes to Eve, this should actually sound very familiar, because it's an argument that plays out in our culture today all the time. And it tells us it's just the psychology of women. Satan knew what he was doing, and again, he knew how to punch the buttons of both sexes. Because what does he approach Eve with? Eve, God's cheating you out of equality. He knows if you eat this, you'll be equal with him, and he's cheating you out of your equal quality. He's oppressing you. Eve, you're in need of empowerment. Here, eat this fruit, it's empowering. Does that argument not sound familiar? That is exactly how women today get sold on the most ridiculous ideas in the world. And don't get me wrong, I'm going to pick on the men here in a minute, but let me just show you how this argument oftentimes plays out in our culture today. Kill your children through abortion. It's empowering. Be sexually promiscuous, sleep with lots of men, make an OnlyFans account and expose yourself, through pornographic pictures to the whole world. It's empowering to you. See, the most self-destructive, evil things in the world can get sold to women, but how is the package done? Because again, men get talked into lots of evil things too, but how is it packaged to women? It's normally always packaged with, it's empowerment. You're being victimized, and you're being cheated out of equality, and you need empowerment. And see, he punched this button because this has been working for thousands of years, because again, it's just something that appeals to the psychology of women, because they think more emotionally. But see, he got the man too. It wasn't like Adam performed well. Adam totally failed at his role as well. But as we're going to see in the New Testament, Adam wasn't deceived. It wasn't because, Eve, sincerely believed what the snake told her. So she's thinking, oh, I've got enlightenment, and I've been empowered here, and she thinks this is true. We know for a fact from the New Testament that's not what Adam thought. So what's going on with him? Well, he's obviously appeasing her. Now, I'm trying not to get graphic about this, but I want to be honest with the audience. One of the obvious, weaknesses of men is, again, their visual appeal to women, and particularly their sex drive. Again, all we have to do is just look at history, and again, just look at advertising. How oftentimes do you see products, marketed to men, and in one way or another, there's an attractive woman in a bikini or some scantily-clad outfit, and they're using sex appeal to appeal to men and to talk them into things. Because men have an inherent weakness with the level of testosterone that they have, and their visual appeal to women, that if they start letting their hormones do their thinking for them, they don't do logical, intelligent things, and they get led into being very, very stupid. I mean, and again, not only is it the sex appeal, but oftentimes it's the desire to appease or impress a woman that they care about. All you have to do is look at the example of Solomon. Wisest man who ever lived. What was his downfall? His wives. He gets seduced by the beauty of, I want to be with all these beautiful women, and then he lets his lust and his sex drive kind of drive him, and then he wants to appease them, and make them happy. Well, then he starts building temples to their gods, and being involved in it. Totally leads him off path, regardless of how wise he is, because that's an inherent weakness of men. Adam's got a naked woman standing in front of him, talking him into doing this. He's also got a wife who again has been emotionally deceived here, by what the snake told her. Now, what he should have done was just taking a stance and going, no, don't you remember? God said don't do this. This is a very black and white issue. It's very simple. God said don't do it. You're wanting to do it. There's really nothing else involved here. What he was likely would have heard is, well, Adam, you never listen to what I have to say. You must not love me. You never care about my feelings. And see, that could have gotten a lot more complicated, and he's trying to avoid these things. He's appeasing. And he gives in and goes along with it. And see, as we're going to see, even like in the example of Solomon, and even we're going to see examples with ancient Israel, very often this happened where Satan used women he had deceived to then get to the man and then play upon their weaknesses, and this is typically how this often plays out. But again, just to reinforce what I mentioned about biblical gender roles, turn over to 1 Corinthians 14. And you'll see why I speculate that God probably gave Adam the instructions to instruct Eve, to kind of basically pass on to her the instructions that he had given about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And again, that's just opinion and speculation. But here's what I base it on. Looking in 1 Corinthians 14 in verse 34. Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. For they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Now again, he's speaking more of teaching in church and such. It's not that women don't have brains, don't having opinions. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I'm just pointing out the fact of the role of spiritual leadership that the husband is supposed to play in the family. Because this is emphasized several times in the New Testament. So turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 2. It's 1 Timothy chapter 2. And this is where we'll see, as I mentioned, we know conclusively from the Bible that Eve was deceived. When Satan approached her in the garden and kind of gave her his sales pitch, she sincerely believed, the line of bull that he gave her. Whereas Adam, we know, wasn't sucked into that. There were different motivations here that were causing him to go astray. So look here in verse 11, in 1 Timothy 2 and verse 11. Let the woman learn in silence with submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. So this is how we know conclusively, that Adam wasn't deceived, but Eve was. As I mentioned, they both messed up, and as we didn't read the rest of the story there in Genesis 3, but once God confronts them, nobody takes responsibility for their behavior. Both parties start pointing the fingers and blaming everybody else but themselves, but they both messed up. But you see the undermining of the roles that should have happened, because Eve doesn't go and ask, Adam about any of this or discuss it with him. She just takes action and then go tells him, I found empowerment and enlightenment, and then she starts leading him, and then he doesn't take a stand, and try to be a leader. He just appeases and follows along, and then everything falls apart. And as we're going to see here, in the Garden of Eden, this is where things started to go wrong. But as you know, societal destruction happens in Genesis chapter 6, when we have the flood. But I want you to see here is, again, this same correlation of the family structure and the undermining of all of this played a big role in this as well. So turn over to Genesis chapter 6, because this is, probably between, I'll just give you broad numbers here, probably somewhere between 1600 and 1700 years after the Garden of Eden. But we'll see here in Genesis chapter 6 what led up to the flood. This is in verse 1. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of them they chose. And Jehovah said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, let his days shall be 120 years. And there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterwards. And then the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. And they were mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then Jehovah saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And then Jehovah was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And so Jehovah said, I will destroy man who I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of Jehovah. So we can see here, this is where we wind up with societal destruction, and God saying, it's just gotten so evil, I've got to wipe it out. But to understand the dynamics of what's happening here, the first thing we've got to do is unpack this phrase here, sons of God. Because a lot of wild speculation and incorrect concepts come about from these couple of verses here. Because it says, the sons of God get with the daughters of men, and then they have children. And then it connects this with, everything going awry, and, society becoming so evil, God says, I just got to wipe it out. Well, you have to understand what that's getting at, because sometimes people make kind of wild speculations and they go, oh, well, this must be about, angelic beings somehow, mating with human women, and you got these hybrid offsprings, and, just kind of wild theories as a result of that, which is not at all what this is talking about. The key to understanding here is realizing this phrase, sons of God. It's used numerous times throughout the Bible. And it can be referred to human beings or even spirit beings, but the distinction it's making is those who are trying to, to faithfully obey God versus those who are not. And that's the distinction playing out here. But you can keep your finger here in Genesis 6. We're going to come back here in a minute. But let me just look at a handful of scripture so you kind of understand how this phrase is used. So turn over to Matthew chapter 5. I'm just going to quickly look at a handful of scriptures here that use this phrase, because I want you to see the trend of how this phrase is used. Because again, the distinction of what this phrase is getting at is referring to those who are obeying God versus those who don't. And it's Matthew 5 and verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And notice it says, we'll call the sons of God, those who are peacemakers, those who are following God's instructions to be peacemakers, they're going to be referred to as sons of God. So again, the whole issue here is who's obeying him. So also turn over to Galatians 3. Again, we're just going to quickly look at a few scriptures here. Just want you to see that there's a very clear trend here in Scripture. It's Galatians 3 and verse 26. For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Again, you see this concept of sons of God. Well, those are those who are faithfully obeying God and following his way. Because we're going to see here the Bible will even contrast, sons of God, children of God with children of Satan. But let's look at one more example here over in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8 and verse 12. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. For you do not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you receive the spirit of adoption by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. And if indeed we suffer with him, we will also be glorified together. Now the contrast with this is children of the devil. Now turn over to John chapter 8. In John chapter 8, and we'll start reading in verse 42. Jesus said to them, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. And when he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. So again, you see this contrast. Well, sons of God are those who are trying to obey God and follow him faithfully. Children of the devil, it's not the issue that the devil created them or somehow responsible for their existence. It's no, they're following his way of life. They're following his character. They're being more molded into his image in terms of how they're behaving. That's the distinction here. And this term sons of God is also used to refer to angelic beings in the same type of context. So just quickly turn over to the book of Job, to Job chapter 1. We'll just see a couple of references here because I want you to see that it's used the same way with angelic beings just like it is with humans. It's Job chapter 1 in verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Jehovah, and Satan also came among them. I notice here there's a meeting of the angels, and he says, well, the sons of God all came before the Father, and yeah, Satan came too. So obviously Satan's not included in the definition of sons of God. Well, we know Satan's a created angelic being as well, but when he rebelled and again totally went in the other direction, and went in an evil way of life, well, he now no longer meets the definition of sons of God because it's about those who obey him. And just look over in chapter 2, verse 1, we'll see the same thing again here. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Jehovah, and Satan came among them to present himself before Jehovah. Again, that same contrast. You have the sons of God, the righteous angels, and then Satan, because he doesn't meet that definition. Okay, with all that in mind, let's just turn back over to Genesis chapter 6. And now we can kind of have a context to unpack what's happening here. So Genesis chapter 6. And we'll start back here in verse 1 because I want to kind of unpack this as we read through this. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God, those who were righteously following God, saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful. Now notice the human weakness. They're being sucked in by beauty and by visual appeal. That's where they're going to go wrong. And they took wives of them, and they chose. Now notice the daughters of men. If you're contrasting this with the sons of God, well, what you've obviously got is, those descendants, of Adam and Eve here, as the world kind of grew, who've tried to follow the true God and have tried to be righteous versus those who've rebelled and gone their own way. And now you have basically the same mistake that Solomon made. You have those who are the men who are trying to faithfully follow God who look at women who are not and going, well, she really is pretty though. really like me, a girl that's that pretty, and not thinking, but wait a minute, her value system, her way of life, how she conducts herself, it's not in line with God's way. Doesn't matter how nice looking she is. This is a bad idea. Well, they're not thinking with the brain, so they start making bad decisions here. That's what's happening here. So now pick up in verse 3. And then Jehovah said, my spirit shall not strive with men forever, for he is indeed flesh, and yet his days shall be 120 years. And there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterwards. And when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, and these were mighty men, or were of old, men of renown. But notice right after, they have these children together and form these marriages. Now notice the next verse, what happens. Then Jehovah saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. It ended badly. It probably took a period of time, for this to play out, but the end result of this was a train wreck. In verse 6, and Jehovah was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Jehovah said, I will destroy man who I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air. For I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of Jehovah. You notice what happened here is again, you had what's called the sons of God. In other words, men who are trying to live a righteous life and follow God. But what happens? They get seduced with their lust and looking, those women, they're real nice, attractive. I think I want to get with her, and not thinking, no, but is her value system, is she trying to follow God? Is she trying to live a righteous life? Is this someone I should, plan my life with? If you'd been thinking logically like that, wouldn't go down this road. Because see, this is something the Bible warns us against repeatedly. And let's just notice one brief section of this. This is turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 7. There are warnings on this in both the Old and New Testament. We're just going to notice one reference here that Moses warned Israel about here, about this very thing, and what the result would be. It's Deuteronomy 7 and verse 1. And then Jehovah your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out the many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when Jehovah your God delivers delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter to your son. For they will turn your sons away from following me, to serve other gods, to anger Jehovah. So the anger of Jehovah will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. Unfortunately, in the past, sometimes these scriptures got, interpreted as somehow a racial issue of, interracial marriage. That's not the focus of what Moses is talking about. Notice his logic is not where you're going to mix your bloodlines. It's they have very pagan practices. They worship other gods. And if you enter into marriages with them, that's going to wind up corrupting you, because now you're going to have to figure out how to get along with each other. And you're going to have to figure out how to raise the children. And all these other issues are going to come up. And then you're going to wind up compromising on your values and going away from God to just try to make peace and to get along with each other. And again, you just look at the example of Solomon. That's exactly what, the wisest man who ever lived, that's his undoing, because that's the weakness of men. But as I mentioned, you see this trend of basically, it starts in the Garden of Eden. How did it start? With basically undermining gender roles. And one of the big things being that, again, the husband's supposed to be the spiritual leader. And where do we have in Genesis 6? What's the final straw that is just the destruction of society? Again, tearing apart the family structure, the abandonment of the proper biblical gender roles, and it results in a society becoming so evil that God has to destroy it. You see, what we're seeing in our culture today, again, rampant debauchery, gender confusion, we can easily look at that and go, well, that's just so insane. I want no part of that, but we got to remember where it starts. It doesn't start that severe. It starts with, again, just basically compromising biblical gender roles, and then we just slowly over time, work in that direction. And the Bible directly tells us these very issues are going to be a problem at the end time as well. Turn over to Luke chapter 17. So I want you to notice here the examples that Christ ties to the end time. It's Luke chapter 17. And we're going to start reading in verse 26. As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it also be in the days of the Son of Man. They ate and they drank and they married wives and were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And the flood came and destroyed them. Likewise, it shall also be in the days of Lot, as it was also in the days of Lot. They ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they built. But on the day that Lot went out of Sodom, fire rained down from brimstone in heaven and destroyed them all. Even so will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Now, obviously, his focus here is on the fact that the society was going on, kind of day-to-day life as normal, and then destruction came upon them quickly. But again, if we look at the other themes in these stories, what happens? Again, the basic undermining of biblical gender roles, society then basically slowly becoming so evil that it's just then full of complete debauchery, to where even just the basic foundation of society of that there's men and women and the roles they're supposed to play totally falls apart. And then society gets destroyed. And see, we're specifically warned about this in terms of the end time. Turn over to Isaiah chapter 3. In Isaiah chapter 3, we'll see here where he's describing basically what the end time is going to be like. And I want you to notice the specific reference to the breakdown of the family and biblical gender roles. Because if you read through, Isaiah 2 starts off, a section addressing the millennium, and you'll see the rest of the chapter is clearly addressing the day of the Lord. And that theme, carries into chapter 3. So it's that very end time frame that we're talking about. But we're just going to break into the context here and start in verse 8. For Jerusalem stumbled and Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against Jehovah, to provoke the eyes of his glory, to look on their countenance and witnesses against them. And they declare their sin as Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to their soul, for they have brought evil upon themselves. So say to the righteous that it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with them, for the reward is his hands and will be given to him. And as for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, those who lead cause you to err and destroy the path of your ways. Notice the family structure has fallen apart. You don't have proper male leadership, being the spiritual leader of the family, and you've got wild, unruly children. You have basically the complete breakdown of the nuclear family is what's taking place here. As you can see, this is what ultimately results in a society falling apart to destruction. But what we in the Church of God need to be aware of is, an observation I've made over the years, just watching the culture and watching the environment we see in the Church of God, is oftentimes in the Church of God, we see how far astray the culture around us has gone. For example, I doubt any of us would be in favor of the Pride Month celebrations and all the transgender issues and homosexuality and that kind of thing. We clearly see that as debauchery we want no part of. But oftentimes what can happen to us is in the church of God, sometimes we become milder versions of the culture around us. In other words, we become infected, and influenced by the culture around us. And yeah, we're not near as evil and as bad, down the road as where the culture has gone. But we've unfortunately at times, moved in that direction more than we realized because we've allowed the culture to affect us. And see, that's exactly what happened to Lot. Turn over to 2 Peter chapter 2, because this is what we in the Church of God really need to be on the lookout for. Because again, I don't think any of us, want to embrace the culture that we're in, but we need to be aware of how it may have affected us. It's 2 Peter 2 and verse 4. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterwards would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed with the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. In other words, he was very affected by the culture around him. And we've already seen, he has the mob coming around his house, who are demanding that the angels be sent out to them because they want to, commit gang rape in a homosexual manner with the men that are there, the angels. But what's Lot's solution? Don't be so evil to do homosexual gang rape. Do heterosexual gang rape. Take my daughters. I don't know about you. I wouldn't want to be his daughter, to be treated like that. I mean, that's kind of a weak response to it all. It's like, yeah, he's not as bad as the culture around him, but this is not Father of the Year material here. This is pretty embarrassing, for how this guy behaved. But let's also look at how it affected the whole family. Let's turn over to Genesis chapter 19. We'll see that living in this environment, again, even though, again, they were probably much better than the culture around them, but they were very affected by living in the environment that they were in. It's Genesis chapter 19 and verse 30. And then Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him. And he was afraid to dwell in Zoar, and he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. Now the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is no man on the earth to come in to us, as is the custom of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. So they made their father drink wine at night. And the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when they lay down or when she arose. And it happened the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, Indeed, I lay with my father last night. Well, let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineages of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down and when she rose up. Thus the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. Now notice what happened here. What played out here is what we would typically refer to today as date rape. They basically be drugged him and then had sex with Lot. But just think about it. I mean, there's just a whole slew of dynamics here, that show you just how far off track this whole family wound up, because they wound up letting the culture around them greatly corrupt them. They weren't as bad as the culture around them. They can look at the rest of the culture and say, look how bad these people in Sodom and Gomorrah are, and that was true. But they weren't a lot to brag about either, in terms of their own character. And that, brethren, is what we need to be aware of. As I mentioned from the beginning of this sermon, what we're witnessing today is literally the demise of Western civilization. The culture that we're watching, the debauchery, the gender confusion, this is all clear indications that we're in Romans 1 territory. We're at the end of a civilization, and it's just a matter of time before all this caves in and falls apart. That's not something we're going to be able to change, or alter that course. What we can do is try to guard our own spiritual condition and to be aware of how well that culture might be affecting us. Because remember, it ends with this severe debauchery and gender confusion. It starts with just compromising on biblical gender roles and compromising on the roles the Bible plays out in Paul's epistles, and even in Peter's writings as well, as to how the family structure should be. So as we go forward from this Sabbath and looking at the culture around us, yes, we live in dire times. We're watching the demise of a civilization. And we're going to have to just trust in God to get us through whatever is going to happen here in the years coming ahead. But the biggest thing we need to be aware of is, again, watching the influence that the culture has on our personal character so that we don't wind up falling into the same bad example of Lot. So let's be aware of where it starts and be guarding our own character.